This is Kate at the Library of Whispers, and today I am reading to you part 14 from my ghost mystery story, Hallows House. This part is called The Old Hall. Let's begin. Rachel, what do you mean? We've got to check this out, I shouted after her as she raced out of the kitchen. Check out what? She reappeared some moments later with both of our outdoor coats and hats under her arm. She rammed her own woolly hat on her head and threw my coat to me. Mum, have you got another torch? She asked hurriedly. What for? I asked. Put your coat on, Mum, she said, ignoring my question. You'll probably need your wellies too. It's still wet out there. I shook my head and put my coat down on one of the kitchen worktops. No, Rachel, I'm not going anywhere. The casserole is nearly ready and it's pitch black out there, I said. Which is why we need another torch, she said, bending down and rummaging through the cupboard under the sink. I'm not going out in the cold, particularly when I have no idea where I'm going and what I'm supposed to be doing when I get there, I said stubbornly. Rachel stood up with her head torch in her hand. This'll do, she said, handing me the torch and reaching over to turn off the oven. Mum, please put your coat on, and I'll tell you on the way. 10 minutes later, I found myself leaving the house in a hurry, with a head torch in my hand and little explanation from Rachel about where we were going. I'd even forgotten that I was supposed to be annoyed with her. We'll take the shortcut to the hall, she said, grabbing my arm and pulling me to the left and towards the end of our road. What shortcut? It's a dead end, isn't it? I said. No, there's a gate, and beyond that a path. It cuts through part of the old orchard and around to the back of the manor house, she answered. How do you know that? I said. Don't ask, Mum, she sighed, nudging my arm again in an attempt to get me to walk faster. Another one of your dreams? I asked. Something like that, she said, as we approached an old wooden fence which marked the end of the road. It was about 4 feet high, and at the rear of it was a thick overgrowth of tall bushes and trees. Rachel took out her torch and switched it on. She pointed it at the fence and began to scan the area with the light. The gate should be here somewhere, she said. I turned on my own torch and also pointed it at the fence. A little way down and to the right I found a metal ring attached to a rusty latch. I think this is it, I shouted over to Rachel, but it was too late. In her impatience, she'd already given up her search and was beginning to mount the fence. Suddenly, she jumped down over it and disappeared into the darkness beyond, and I was left alone. Rach, I shouted to her nervously. Her head reappeared a moment later through the shrubbery, and she beckoned me towards her. Mum, we haven't got time for the gate. It's easier just to climb over, she said. Easy for you, maybe, I said, placing my foot uneasily on the lowest rung of the fence. I clambered over and landed ungracefully on the other side with Rachel catching my fall. She took my torch and placed it over the woolly hat on my head. This'll free up your arms, she said. I reached up and touched the warm lens of the head torch. Great, I said. It's a good job it's dark. I feel like a right idiot. Now are you going to tell me what we're doing? to avoid her grasp. She turned away from me in annoyance and walked off, disappearing into the darkness. "Rachel," I cried. "Are you coming or what?" she shouted back to me. "It doesn't look like I have a choice," I replied. I waded through the long, wet grass and shrubs until I caught up with her. She reached out her hand to help me navigate a particularly dense patch of lumpy vegetation. It was muddy underfoot, and apart from the torches lighting our way and an occasional glimpse of the moon as it peeked through the dark clouds overhead, it was eerily dark. I could hear the cawing of crows and the muffled rumblings of a lorry making its way along Monk's Ferry Lane in the distance. "How are we going to get in?" I said, as Rachel continued to guide me through the undergrowth. "I don't know yet," she answered. "I'll work that out when we get there. Anyway, I brought this." She stopped and undid the top 2 buttons on her overcoat and pulled out a rusty crowbar. "Where on earth did you get that?" I asked in astonishment. "It was in the shed. I found it the other day. Thought it'd come in useful," she said. "What? Useful for breaking into an ancient manor house in the dark?" I said sarcastically. "I should never have encouraged you to read all those famous 5 books when you were a child." "Yes, it's your fault," she said, matching my sarcasm. She reached over and grabbed my sleeve again and pulled me forwards. "There should be a path here somewhere," she said after a while, directing her torch towards the ground. "Yes, here it is, look." At her suggestion, I looked down and my torch picked up an area of rectangular terracotta tiles. I kicked some of the wet weeds away with my boot, and more of the tiles appeared. They were arranged in a fancy herringbone design and did indeed appear to form some kind of path. As we carried on moving forward, our way now became clearer. Rachel had gone ahead of me again, and all I could see of her was her breath as she exhaled in the cold night air. "Point your torch to the right, Mum," she shouted back to me. "That old brick wall, see? That's the top of a well. It means we're close to the back of the house." I did as she asked and scanned the low red brick wall with my light. "Probably not a good idea to get too close then if it's a well, Rachel," I shouted back. "It's so dark we could easily lose our footing and tumble in." I couldn't see her face in the darkness, but I imagined that she was probably rolling her eyes at me right now. She was her father's daughter, always throwing caution to the wind, a risk-taker in a way that I had never been. Suddenly she stopped walking and I quickly caught up with her. She was standing with her torch pointed up at an expanse of old red brick wall. "Look," she said, "I think we're at the back of the house. From memory, there should be some stone steps around here somewhere. They lead to a back entrance and some large double doors with fancy glass panels, like stained glass." "From memory?" I asked, confused by her suggestion. She didn't answer. I still had no idea how Rachel knew all this, but I followed her lead as she began picking her way along the back perimeter of the house in search of the steps. I could hear her kicking away weeds from the ground with her boots. Then suddenly the scraping noises stopped. I looked up. Moonlight was beginning to slowly seep through the spreading clouds overhead. I could now pick out Rachel's silhouette as she bounded up a set of mossy-stained stone steps. As she got to the top, she looked back at me and waved excitedly. easily. I moved over to the panel and began to assist her by tugging at it with my hands. I can't quite believe I'm doing this, I muttered under my breath. Suddenly, the whole section of rotten panel became detached from its rusty nails and fell to the ground with a loud crash which echoed around the hall's grounds. Well, that's all the neighbours alerted, I said, looking at Rachel in horror. She shrugged. It's fine, Mum. There's nobody around. On a night like this, they're probably all huddled up around a warm fire watching telly. Lucky them, I said, raising my eyebrows and stamping my feet against the cold. Rachel shone her torch at the door we had revealed. It was of a hefty oak construction, with a rusty iron handle in the centre. There were 2 panels, one above the other. The top section was made of glass, and was still intact despite its obvious age. It appeared to be made up of small pieces of leaded coloured glass, the stained glass that Rachel had mentioned. I rubbed away at a small section of the glass with my gloved hand and revealed some fancy lettering underneath all the dust and grime. I can see a G and maybe a D, I said, turning to Rachel. Can you make out any more? She rubbed her own gloved hand over the same area and then shook her head. No, not really, but there also seems to be some kind of picture too. A castle or a church and some trees. Could it be the priory? I said. Maybe, she answered, as she began kicking at the lower part of the door with her boot. Should you really be doing that, Rach? I said, looking concerned. What if this place is a listed building or something? This feels like vandalism. Well, first of all, Mum, we've practically broken in already, and anyway, this is just a thin piece of plywood or something. See, she said, pointing her torch at the grubby board, while continuing to kick at it with her foot. It's not part of the original door, and it's really loose. I think we should be able to get into the house through here. There's that wee word again, I said sarcastically. But won't it be dangerous? What if we fall through a rotten floor or something? We won't know how dangerous it is until we get inside, said Rachel, giving the plywood a final kick. That's not reassuring, I said, as I watched her crouch down and disappear through the newly made hole in the door. I could hear her shuffling around inside, and I watched the beam of her torch flashing this way and that. A couple of minutes later, she reappeared at the opening and looked up at me with a huge grin on her face. Mum, this place is amazing, she said. It's like time's stood still. What do you mean? I asked. Everything is still here, all the furniture, the chandeliers and curtains and things, and most of it's covered up with massive sheets, she said, adding, Are you coming in? I bit my lip nervously. Does it look safe? I asked. She grabbed the bottom of my coat with her gloved hand and tugged hard. Come on, Mum, it'll be fine. Think of it as a mini adventure. I was seriously hoping that my mini adventure wouldn't become a mini nightmare, as Rachel helped me to my feet on the other side of the door. We appeared to be in a large, spacious hallway with an elaborately tiled floor. Dotted here and there around the edges of the room were various large objects covered in old dust sheets. Rachel had partially removed some of the sheets, revealing a couple of chairs and a wide sideboard with a cracked glass mirror. Large tapestry curtains with enormous tasselled tie-backs were draped over many of the huge boarded-up windows. I walked over That's not a piece of furniture that's been left neglected for decades. Before she could answer, something large and furry scuttled past my feet and made me jump. "Rachel, there are rats here," I exclaimed, moving quickly out of the furry creature's way. She shrugged and then grinned. "Maybe the rats have been doing the dusting." "Maybe," I said, smiling back. I moved to the centre of the room and looked up. As I did so, my head torch picked out a domed glass ceiling rising a good 70 feet above me. "Wow," I said, looking over at Rachel. "Have you seen this?" She joined me and pointed her more powerful torch up at the ceiling. "I know, it's incredible," she said. "You know, I think there's a balcony at the top. I bet the view from up there is amazing." I nodded. "Probably, although it's giving me vertigo just thinking about it." Rachel grinned at me again. "Anyway, let's keep going," she said, turning away and walking over to a wide wooden staircase at the far end of the hall. She began ascending the stairs at a trot, and I cautiously followed on behind. The mahogany banister attached to the staircase felt surprisingly sturdy as I leant on it to steady my way, and it was reassuring to know that I wasn't about to tumble to my death by way of a rotten tread. "You know, this place is in remarkably good condition inside," I shouted up to Rachel. "How long has it been empty?" "I'm not sure," she said, without turning around, "but it must be years." At the top, Rachel made a turn to the right, and we continued to ascend another 2 sets of identical stairs. I guessed we must now be on the 3rd floor of the manor house. Rachel now turned to the left and guided me along a number of narrow, dark corridors. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. At the end of one of the corridors, she suddenly stopped dead and pointed at an arched wooden door with an iron handle. Turning to me slowly, she said, "In here." "Okay," I said slowly. "I'm guessing you think you know what's in here." She nodded. "A staircase to the attic." "The attic?" I exclaimed. "Seriously, Rachel, does it have to be the attic? You know there's probably going to be spiders up there and who knows what." "Mum, it's where the light's been coming from," she answered. "If you want to wait down here, that's fine. I'll go up by myself." I looked around at the dark, empty corridor behind me. No, I'll take my chances in the attic," I said, adding, "Anyway, the door might be locked," secretly hoping that it was. Rachel took hold of the iron handle, and it turned easily in her grasp. She looked back at me and Rachel's hand and squeezed it tightly. "What is it?" Rachel whispered urgently to me. I shook my head. I had no idea. Suddenly, the apparition stopped moving, and the strange light ceased its swaying. "Who are you?" boomed a man's voice from the direction of the unidentified form. "And what are you doing here?" it demanded. "Do we answer it?" Rachel said to me, again in a hushed whisper. I didn't answer, but took a couple of steps forward and focused my head torch on the spectre's face. I recognised something familiar in that voice. "Mum, come back! It's got something in its hand!" exclaimed Rachel. I bravely took another couple of steps forward and then stopped. "Bert," I said, peering into the darkness, "is that you?" And that ends